So I want to present to you today a work that we are in the process of publishing with Döring and Cieciuch about the development of value structure. And mostly I'm going to ask, mostly I want to talk today about the development of children's value structures and how children learn and adapt to understanding value structures during their middle childhood. For that reason, I will present very briefly the theory of personal values, assuming that most people who come here know it to some extent, and talk a bit about why do we care about a structure of values and what does a structure of values actually mean. Then I will make some kind of a detour into values of children and why we would expect any development in values of children, and test the hypothesis in 2 different studies, and hopefully make some conclusions, or even very hopefully have substantiated conclusions. So let's start with values. So as most of you hopefully know very well, values are guiding principles. They are very abstract goals that describe the end states we try to approach, we try to pursue throughout our lives. And these values help us determine behaviors, attitudes, evaluations of people, of other behaviors. And we are very likely to use them in our everyday life, as well as in life-determining choices. The theory of personal values by Shalom Schwartz applies 10 motivationally distinct values, at least in its classic form. And these values are differentiated by their internal motivations, the underlying motivations that guide them. And one very important aspect of the theory is the structure of values. So basically what we describe values that are not just a list. There's not a set list of values like a grocery list. There are values that are dynamically related. By dynamically related, I mean that there are associations between the values. So if you value one of the values, you are likely to also value similar values, and you're likely to value non-similar or conflicting values to a lower extent. If we can just mute the participants that have wind in the background, that would be wonderful. So what I mean by that is that, for example, if I have an individual, a child or an adult that values benevolence or care for others, this person is likely to value to a similar extent, or at least highly, other values that are similar to that or have similar underlying motivations. For example, tolerance. Part of the reason for that is that if I promote care in my everyday behaviors, this is likely to promote tolerance, and vice versa. If I'm tolerant towards someone, that is a very caring act. However, there are other values that might conflict with that in their motivations, but also in their consequences. So if I'm behaving very tolerantly and I'm caring, that is likely to take some power or some status or some resources from me. I might invest resources in others. So values such as power are likely to be less important to people who value care or value tolerance highly. So there are dynamic associations all the time between the values, with some values enhancing each other and other values hindering each other. This dynamic structure was replicated across multiple samples, across cultures in the world. And I think it is important because it has implications for the psychological functioning of individuals. So basically, people who have a coherent structure of values are likely to have a sense of coherence in the self. So you're likely to experience yourself as someone who knows what he or she wants, as someone who has a clear understanding of the self. The structure of values also has consequences for decision-making. If I go into the world and I approach a social dilemma, if I have a clear structure of values, that means that I would know how to decide. For example, if I have a situation in which I have to choose between what is good for myself or others, if I value care clearly more than status and power, my decision is clear. But if I have both values important to the same extent, each time I'm facing a dilemma, I will have to make the decision again and again. So decision-making becomes easier when you have a clear structure of values. The structure of values was very typically studied at a between individual level. What do I mean by that? We usually go to a sample, we pass on questionnaires, people rate or rank their values, and then we check how are the values of individuals associated. So basically we do correlations between values of individuals. And we say that if someone, let's say Ross, okay, Ross values benevolence highly, that means that he values that more than others in the sample. And he's also likely to value universalism more than others individuals of this, in the sample. And he is likely to value power less than other individuals of this, in the sample. So the association are checked or collaborated and corroborated within the sample. However, the hypotheses were not at the sample level. When I described what a structure means, I described a within individual structure, which is what the theory claims. Basically, it claims that if I value benevolence more than all of my other values, I am likely to value universalism more than other values. And I'm likely to value power less than universalism and less than benevolence. So the hypotheses were at the within individual level. It talks about my own values, the values of that individuals, not about other people in the sample. And indeed, in the past few years, people found ways in which they can test whether within individual we can find the theoretical structure of values. It started in 2014 and continued on with new methods that enable us to test the value structure within individuals. And indeed, the value structure was found and what was replicated within individuals. I'll show you how in a minute. But before I get to technicalities of how we test that, I want to do my detour. I promised you a detour and talk about children's values. So when I started my PhD under the supervision of Ariel Knaffen-Noam, who's here in the audience today, we didn't talk about children's values. We talked at most about adolescents' values. The classical theorists talked about values as something that you develop during adolescence. When you start as a child, you are likely to be motivated by external goals. The society directs you. And during adolescence, you start wondering who I am, what is important to me. You develop a set of values. And indeed, the measures were built accordingly. When we started measuring values before my time, they used the Schwartz Value Survey, they used later the Portrait Values Questionnaires. These questionnaires are very abstract, they are very general, and children are not able to use these measures in order to express their values. So values were just not investigated among children. However, from developmental psychology, we know that very early on, children have goal-directed behaviors. They set goals and they get out to get them. And the goals that children use are in many ways equivalent to the goals that we know as direct in the value system. For example, very young children have promotion goals and prevention goals. So they want to achieve something and they try to be autonomous, they try to be independent, or they want to protect themselves and be safe and adhere to conventions. These are very similar to openness to change and conservation values. Children have goals of caring and giving from a very young age, but they also have goals of keeping resources to themselves, succeeding, gaining appreciation. These goals are very similar to self-transcendence and self-enhancement values. So is it possible that before adolescence, children already have values? This question was started to be investigated a bit more than a decade ago. It started with Anna Döring in her PhD in Munster, and she created the first children's values questionnaire that I will show you later. And what was unique about this questionnaire and another questionnaire that was since then developed by Julie Lee, they are very concrete. They do not ask about general ethics. They do not ask about equality for all. They show people concrete situation and ask, how important is that in your life? And we find that children can answer these questions. And when they answer these questions, they answer in very coherent ways and in ways that we can identify and ways that we understand. So in many ways, the priorities that they report are similar to the priorities that adults report. For example, if adults typically value self-transcendence values, so care for others, for society, quite highly, so do children. If adults develop self-enhancement values, report them quite as low in their importance, so do children. Children are quite stable in their preferences, and with age they become more stable. So if they are asked again a year later, we usually find test risk-test associations. We find gender differences that are similar to the gender differences that are found among adults. So there are many indications that whatever it is that children report is quite similar to the values that we know. And one of the strongest indications for that is the fact that children's values have a structure. And by structure, we mean interrelations between the values at the sample level. So if we do this MDS map that we usually do among adults, among children, we find clear differentiation between the 4 higher order values. And we find some differentiation, and not a bad one, between the 10 specific values. So children appear to be able to associate values in meaningful ways. When they think of caring for others, they think of it as something quite similar to caring for the environment, universalism and benevolence values. So there are differentiations in the values that are meaningful. And why is it that I'm talking to you about 4 values are clear, 10 values not as much, but quite well? Because it is quite a task to create a value structure. Why is it such a task? Value structure requires implicit, not necessarily explicit, comparisons and contrasts that it's not easy to make. Cognitively, it's quite a task because you have to understand multiplicity. You have to compare many different concepts and say, I like this more than that. And across social context in middle childhood, we know that children have a hard time doing such comparisons, in doing such contrast and holding the 2 sides in their head at the same time. And during middle childhood, children continuously become better at that. So if they have conflicting goals, they learn how to resolve them. If they see multiple perspectives, so 2 individuals see the same situation from different perspectives, they learn how to understand that. If they experience conflicting emotions or ambivalent emotions, they become better at perceiving that and not just deciding on one of them. If they see conflicting moral concerns, and on, as you can see, across contexts, children improve in their ability to resolve multiplicity and to contrast. So if I'll take traits that might be a bit similar in some ways to values, during middle childhood, children learn to say, in one context I am like that, in another context I am like that, and identifying the conflict and then resolving the conflict. Children learn how to do that during middle childhood, approaching adolescence. So we'll hypothesize basically that the integration of the value system into a coherent system will also become better or easier during middle childhood. So basically we asked, does the structure or the interrelations between values improve with age? And one indication that this might be the case came from a study I conducted with Julie Lee and colleagues a few years back, in which we looked for the first time at the intra-individual structure of children. And you can see here the first unfolding plot from this study. Unfolding is a method that is used in order to create these within individual structures. Basically, what it does, it creates the structure from the bottom up. We don't describe to the program what should be the structure of the values. We basically give them the priorities that children give. And for each child, the program transform the value priorities into dissimilarities. By dissimilarities, I mean, for example, if a child values benevolence highly, he is not dissimilar. He is very similar to benevolence. He should be close in space to benevolence. If that child does not value power, he should be very far away in space from power. So basically, each individual is here portrayed by one of the smaller circles, the empty circles, and then he's put in space with all the other children, and their values are portrayed respective to the individual. So the values around here are organized as they are, as similar or dissimilar from the people in here. When the people are in the middle like that, we can say that the children have their values around them. You can see the circle here superimposed. The actual circle is superimposed, but the values were created from the bottom up. Here we can see that children's values are somewhere in between within a bidimensional space. There's no clear differentiation into 4 groups of values. We can see here the 3 values that are conservation, 2 values of self-transcendence. So all of these are social values. And here we can see the self-focused values. Children apparently differentiate very well between social values and self-focused values, and their values show this contrast. Children that are closer to the self-focus will be farther away from the social focus, and vice versa. This is at 5 years of age. At 6 to 7 years of age, we still see the children in the middle over here. We can already see a bit more of the value circle. It is a bit more circular here. We can see 3 clear different values, and we can see how the children are in between those values. At 8 to 12 years of age, the differentiation is even better. So there are some indications that children do improve in the way that they understand their values and the way that they structure their values. We wanted to look at that at the individual level and see how each individual changes in their understanding of the value structure during middle childhood. So how did we do that? Our first study was a cross-cultural studies. We had 4,600 children from 12 countries between 6 and 12 years of age. And the children answered the portrait-based, the picture-based value survey for children and a Döring's questionnaire. Basically, they saw pictures like these over here. Each picture portrays a figure. The child is asked to try and imagine themselves in the place of that figure. That figure takes on actions that are in line with the different values, the 10 Schwartz values. There are 20 such items. Each one has a caption that describes what is the value in words, very clear, very concrete. And then children are asked to rank the values from most important to least important on a five-point scale. After the children ranked their values, we started by doing an unfolding analysis like we saw before. So here you can see the unfolding solution. These are all our 4,000 and so children, although the structures were first conducted at the sample level. So for each specific sample, we did that in R. And you can see quite well how the values are along the circle, although not perfectly. And children are in the middle, meaning that children are somewhere in between the values. If one child, for example, the child over here, is a child that is high in their value of stimulation, but very low, that child over here, very low in conformity. So there is this clear trade-off that we see within individual. okay, that child is high in achievement and surprisingly quite low in self-direction. This is not necessarily an association that we would expect. So this is the structure that we have. This is the circle. But then we went beyond what was done in the past studies. For each specific child, each point here in the circle, we extracted the K alienation coefficient. So the K alienation coefficient is based on stress. So if you know stress value, you know the K alienation coefficient. Basically, for each individual, we asked how well their value system is represented by the overall configuration. Some people are very well portrayed by the circle. Their values adhere to the circle very well. Others, in order to push them into the circle, the algorithm had to make compromises. It's not a very good representation of their values. So the higher the K, the less the child fits the circle. So if people were perfectly represented by the structure, the K would have been 0. The K would have been very low. If people are not well represented by the structure, each individual that is not well represented by the structure, their K is higher. And basically, we wanted to ask, what is the association between K and age? So are older children better represented in the sample? So better represented by the value structure. We conducted that for each sample of our 12 samples specifically, and then we created a multi-level model to see what is the weighted association. So what happens within each one of the samples, what is the overall association? And this is what we found in general. We found a quadratic association between age and value structure. So that's not what we expected. What we did expect is this negative association over here. So that negative association says that at the beginning of middle childhood, we find that the older are the children, the more likely they are to be in line with the circle. Their K alienation coefficient is lower. They are represented well. Older children are better represented by the structure. However, we also found this positive, albeit low, association, and that association basically says that at the later ages, approaching adolescence, children become not as well represented by the structure. Their structure becomes a bit messy. They do not differentiate between conflicting values as much, and they might find similar values not as appealing. So what happens here? Before we wanted to conclude and just try and make any clear conclusions, so we wanted to replicate that because that was quite surprising. And our second study was a cross-sequential study. So this study had 2 goals. The first one was replication, but the second was also to try and look within individual. So within developmental studies, we usually say that within individual studies are better than across individual studies. And why is that? Because different cohorts might have different influencing factors. Maybe the youngest children in our sample and the oldest children in the sample had different lifetime events, different social events, and that were the reasons that their K was different. So we wanted to see if a specific individual changed over time in their fit to the structure. This is not a strictly longitudinal study, it is cross-sequential. That means that we had 4 different cohorts, children who started the study at 7, 8, 9, and 10 years of age. And for each one, we looked at their K, at their fit to the structure 3 times. We met them every year across 2 years, so 3 time points. So the youngest children were 7 at the first time point and 9 at the last time point. The oldest children were 10 at the first time point and 12 at the last time point. And each time they answered the portrait-based value, the picture-based value survey over and over again. So again, we start by an unfolding analysis, and here you can see an almost perfect structure. You can see here, again, individuals are within the circle, and the children here that value hedonism much, value tradition less. The people here who value security much, value stimulation less. People here who value power much, value universalism, but also self-direction less. You'll find a very lovely structure over here at the unfolding analysis. But again, we wanted to see how each individual is represented within the system. So how much does each individual contribute to misfit? And we created a K alienation coefficient for each individual. And again, we wanted to associate that with age. This time, because it is a longitudinal sample, we did it a bit differently. We fit a latent growth curve model for each one of the cohorts. So a latent growth curve model basically says that we estimate a regression line for each one of the individuals. So for each one of the individuals, we look at their alienation coefficient at time 1, time 2, and time 3 over here. And we ask, what is their intercept? So where did they start the study? At time 1, what was their alienation coefficient? How well did they fit the structure? But we also look at their slope. How much did they change and how did they change? Did they increase? Did that individual specifically increase over time in their fit to the structure or decrease over time? After we do that for each individual, we can aggregate across individuals in the cohort and ask whether in average children in the cohort increased or decreased in their fit to the structure. The results can be seen here. You can see here different lines for each one of the cohorts we had. The blue ones are the ones that started at 7 years of age, but we followed them until they were 9. The green ones started at 8 years of age, and we followed them until 10, and so on. And you can see here a very clear replication of what we had before in our previous studies. So the youngest cohort decreased over time in their alienation coefficient. That means that they improved in their fit to the structure. The structure was describing them better at older ages. There was no much change at the 8 and 9 years cohort, but the 10 years older, the 10-year children who were 10 at the beginning of the study and grew until 12, they increased in alienation coefficient. That means that their fit decreased over time. So we replicated the results before at the within individual level. What can we learn from that? I think the first thing that I learned here is that there is a structure at a young age. And for me, that is a corroboration of the value theory for children, basically saying that children might have values, they might have goals, and these goals are understood within the context of a dynamic system. So even if children cannot explicitly say, I value benevolence over power, and actually some of them do. We talk to them in other studies, and some of them say, I don't want all that power because I want to be friends with others. They have words to put into this structure. But at least implicitly, it appears that already at very young ages, children have an intra-individual structure. And that means that if they value one value, they value a similar value or a compatible value to a similar extent, and they value a conflicting value to a lower extent. But although they have that at a very young age, they also change over time to achieve a better fit to the structure. And we find at middle childhood that this improvement is in line with what we hypothesized. And we explained that, although we did not check that in this study, we explained that by socio-cognitive development. They may be better able to compare and contrast. We know that there are differences in working memory, there are differences in attention, that children develop their capabilities that they acquire at these ages that may enable them to even mentally compare across the values and contrast across them and understand them better. And we find that important because, as I told you before, we think that as values become better structured, they can be better goals that guide us in life. And we will be better able to use these values in order to direct our behavior. So if children organize their values, they might be better internal motivators and less likely to use external motivations or to change in their motivations across context. But maybe I think the most interesting thing for me here is the result that we did not expect, but was replicated across studies and across methods, is the change that we find at the end of middle childhood, at the later ages. And in that time, we find the decrease in fetal structure. And when we started thinking about what happens there, it sent us back to what we find in value priorities at this time. So approaching adolescence, there's a lot of action in values. These are the ages in which children start to value, especially openness to change values to a higher extent and conservation values less. So basically children approach adolescence and become and start valuing their autonomy, start value their independence, start valuing stimulation. This is driven by social as well as cognitive and even brain mechanism that we know these days. So at this time, children start developing their identity. This is early adolescence, late childhood, somewhere in between. And we suggest that the decrease in fit might be a marker of this change. And if this is indeed the case, that will tell us something, I think, about what value change means. Studies in the past, especially Anat Bardi's studies that I saw that Anat is here as well, show us that as people change in their values change in line with the structure. So if I increase in my values of openness, I'm likely to decrease in my values of conservation. If I increase in self-transcendence, I'm likely to decrease in self-enhancement. People basically recreate an organized system as they change. Maybe what we see here is the middle of this process. Maybe once an individual increases in values of openness to change, for example, they still value conservation because they're still children and they still do as they are told sometimes, and they start feeling this conflict, they start feeling this unease, they find it difficult to make decisions. And as a result of this unease, they start to make the adjustments. So as we find children changing, we found upheaval, we find disentanglement in their values. And this might be a marker of change, not only for children. So future studies should look at how other value structures change. So what happens when we immigrate? What happens when we start a new job that is all-consuming? When I change in my values, do I find this decrease in fit to the value system? And what does it do to me psychologically? What happens to my sense of coherence? What happens to my ability to use values as guides for decision-making? I think this is an interesting result that should be further explored. I think this is it. That's what I had to offer. So thank you for your attention.